Hello, and welcome back to Microsoft Research's lecture series on race and technology. I'm Nancy Boehm. I'm a senior principal research manager at Microsoft Research, and I'm one of the organizers of this series. It's been my massive treat over the last year and for the next couple of months to host this series. We've been highlighting some of the many stellar scholars working at the intersection of race and technology in a range of fields and contexts. We've, believe it or not, had a dozen of these talks now, and every single one of them has been awesome. So if you've missed any, I do encourage you to watch the recordings. Today, we're super happy to have Dr. Desmond Upton Patton. Desmond, Dr. Patton is an Associate Dean for Innovation and Academic Affairs at the Columbia School of Social Work. He's also the founding director of SAFElab and co-director of the Justice, Equity, and Technology group there at Columbia. His work is notable for a lot of things, but one of them that I think is particularly important and relevant for this series is that he's bridging social work and computer science, a quality that has made him a leader in the field of making AI empathetic, culturally sensitive, and less biased. We, in our lab, were lucky to have Desmond as a visitor with us during the spring of 2020, and I have to say I learned an awful lot from getting to spend time with him, and I'm sure that in this hour you will as well. As always, I'm going to be keeping an eye on questions in the Q&A, so please do feel free to pose your questions during the talk. You don't have to wait till the very end, and we'll try and get to them at the end. We have a fair amount of time for Q&A following. And before I turn it over to Desmond for the talk, I will tell you that next month, May 18th, our speaker is going to be Dr. Christina Harrington from Carnegie Mellon University. And she's going to be giving a talk called Freedom Dreams, Imagining Inclusive Technology Futures Through Co-Design with Black Americans. And we will hope to see you there. And now I'm going to hand it over to Desmond. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Desmond Patton, and today I'm going to be talking about designing an AI-driven neighborhood navigator with Black and Latinx New York City residents. I'm a professor of social work, sociology, and data science at Columbia University and director of the SAFElab. I'm really excited to talk about my most recent project, which is a culmination of the work that I've done over the last 10 years, which really aims to leverage social media data, algorithmic, qualitative, and social work approaches to reducing violence and creating thriving on and offline environments. Today's presentation is less about the findings of this work, as we're undergoing rigorous evaluation, but more so about the process of designing this research project, our collaborations across local city government, universities, and community members. Our project is a collaboration between the Columbia School of Social Work and School of Engineering, John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and the Mayor's Office for Neighborhood Partnerships. But before we dive into the work, I want to first level set with all of you with respect to my positionality, how I define myself within the context of my research, and the various disciplines that I rely on in order to pursue my research agenda. I am a gay, cisgender Black man, able-bodied, in an interracial marriage from the South, and a tenured professor at Columbia University. I define myself as a social worker, a social scientist, and a public interest technologist. I trained in anthropology as an undergraduate, studied social work as a master's student at the University of Michigan, and continued my training in social work, injury science, and sociology at the University of Chicago. My interests in technology and social media were driven and motivated by my time with young Black boys and men in Chicago, who granted me the privilege to spend time with them to better understand how they navigated violence in their community. My interests have always been at the intersections of the Black boy and man experience as it relates to community-based violence. This idea of social media as a neighborhood or an environmental context was a new idea for me and a phenomenon that was unfolding, particularly during the time of my dissertation studies. And so my interest in leveraging social media to study violence really has required a transdisciplinary process and a way of being and understanding that allows me to link my training in social work with broader theories in human behavior, with the tools that have afforded us rigorous and innovative opportunities to study large amounts of data on social media. The problem of social media as a trigger for community based violence is not just a story, however, about how users engage social media platforms. We must also contend with how platforms are designed, how artificial intelligence and other emerging technology tools are deployed to control what we see, and the community guidelines that are developed to mitigate harm for some. The problem of social media and community based violence, I believe, is a transdisciplinary issue that requires an integration of not only methods and theories, but also a reimagining of who is at the table, what true community collaboration looks like, and a centering of marginalized voices, ideas, and beliefs that go beyond checkboxes and window dressing. So, my time in Chicago was spent with young black boys and men, and this qualitative endeavor allowed me to uncover what at the time was a relatively new phenomenon, but not new for the young boys and men in my study. So, as we spent time together, I learned more about the ways in which communication on social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram can be both dangerous and helpful for young people of color who are simultaneously navigating the throes of adolescent development and their community life. More specifically, what we've seen over the last decade or so is a merger of complex beefs and taunts within and between crews and cliques that are expressed in short, pithy and posts and images that oftentimes lack context, nuance, and any broader explanation. And so what we now see is what Jeffrey Lane calls the digital street, or Robin Stevens calls the digital neighborhood. And so, in my first paper ever on this topic, internet banking, we decided to define and put some parameters around this new phenomenon that we were hearing about from young people, but at the time there was no literature. And so we engaged the computer mediated communications literature, literature around masculinity and performance to better understand why we may see the type of back and forth communication that oftentimes is escalated into real world physical violence. And so in 2013, we coined the term internet banging, which is oftentimes referred to as cyber banging. This is also one of the first times in which, in my research, I'm establishing this notion that social media is not a virtual land that we dabble in, that social media is essential to our lives as our physical engagements and interactions. And thus, if we really truly want to understand well being, community based violence, and human behavior, that the researcher has to be enveloped into the world of social media. Next, I began to grapple with the importance of critically reflexive annotation and analysis of social media data for the purposes of unearthing deep and robust qualitative responses, but also for the development of machine learning algorithmic systems. A major focus of my research to date has been a multi-year analysis of Jakaira Barnes. This is the image that you see before you. And I studied her intensely from 2014 to 2019. A little bit more about Jakaira. Jakaira was exposed to violence at a very young age and had recurring experiences with death and loss. Just weeks after her birthday, her father was shot and killed. As she entered her formative teenage years, she joined a gang in the Woodlawn neighborhood, which is just south of the University of Chicago, where I was training. The death that seemed to really impact Jakaira's life was of her friend Tyquan Tyler, a 13-year-old boy who was murdered in their neighborhood. She then adopted the Twitter handle Tyquan Assassin in reference to him. Before Jakaira's own brutal and untimely death on April 11, 2013, her good friend Little B was shot and killed by the Chicago police. And so she also took to Twitter to express deep pain, hurt, and ideas around retaliation related to his death. I came to learn about Jakaira in the Chicago Sun-Times, which uh, named her the gun-toting gang girl of Chicago. And what Jakaira did for me in death was force me to reckon with humanity, force me to reckon with my own imbibing of white toxicity and white supremacy and how I viewed young black children, in particular young black girls and women. She forced me to dig deeper and to not take social media at face value. And it became a really important step in my own research process, in my own designing process, to constantly and to intentionally focus on the humanity of the user. Just because they're behind the screen does not mean that these individuals are not real people, that they have stories and narratives, and in particular, stories and narratives of young black girls that are oftentimes pathologized. And so, this ability and need to unpack and reflect and reflex has become a critical design principle in all the work that I've done. And so my focus on Jakaira also uncovered some gaps in reflexive practices for annotating social media data that allowed us to potentially identify our own racial bias in the interpretation of social media. And so within the lab, we created a methodology called the contextual analysis of social media. This is a methodological process to contextually and to, it's a contextually driven process that really focuses on domain specific decisions to labeling social media data for the training of algorithmic systems. This approach is meant to bridge the identified gaps between inadequacies in current language processing tools and differences in geographic, cultural, and age-related variance on social media. This is a team based approach. It's not meant to be done alone, and it is meant to center and privilege the voices and experiences of individuals of color. And so, Chasm and Jakaira and the early qualitative work, these are all prior research studies and experiences that are shaping me as a researcher, me as a black scholar who studies black people. It's shaping the extent to which I think about ethics in my work. It's shaping how I connect with community members and develop true partnerships in the work as well. So each and every study, every experience, every mistake is training me to be a better scholar. It's forcing me to reflect on new approaches and new ideas that may emerge from the data that perhaps I couldn't see before because I was too busy zoning in on the individual and not individuals embedded in communities, embedded in systems. And so every step of the way, these ideas, these processes are building and leading towards this mayor's office project that I'm going to get to very soon. And then I also want to talk about the extreme importance of focusing on inclusion of community members and youth in the research project. And so in the social sciences, big data represents an unprecedented opportunity to understand and support segments of the human population that were at one time too difficult to reach with traditional research methods. Individuals who are marginalized, stigmatized, or living in areas with high rates of violence may not be accessible for most research studies, as they are too geographically dispersed. Experiencing personal anxiety and embarrassment or making face to face contact would pose a significant risk to a participant or research safety. But given the ever growing popularity of the internet and social media and smartphones, these individuals generate data that are able to be acquired and analyzed. As such, various groups, including academics, clinicians, non-governmental agencies, organizations, and governments have seized the opportunity to use social media data as a way of studying human behavior. However, in that process, oftentimes the needs, experiences, and lived realities of community members are not a part of the research process, and these individuals are not a part of the development of algorithmic systems or the ways in which data may be interpreted. And so, in the work that I've done, spending time with community members, I have first understood that I am not the expert in any of this work, that there are lots of folks who have great expertise that is driven by their community experience that must be used as a way of connecting and building true partnerships in this space. And so Another kind of important thing that I've learned in the work is to be intentional about the inclusion of community members and young people in the design and interpretation and the dissemination of the research that we do that is leveraging social media data from their communities. So, given the chance to reflect on my earlier work, there have been a few important lessons learned that have informed my current partnership with the Mayor's Office of New York City. Number one, I think it's important to question if you're asking the right research question, particularly when considering using social media data or working with vulnerable populations. Early in my studies, while my team was reflecting on issues of police surveillance and the ethics of social media analysis, it took longer for us to understand our role and complicit engagement in types of analysis that might be harmful to the population under studying. And so it really forced us to double down on what we've learned as social workers in terms of the reflexive nature of clinical practice and the extent to which we can leverage reflexivity as a clinical tool and interject that into our research process to not only reflect on ethical challenges and problems, but to also own and acknowledge and hold ourselves accountable of the biases and challenges that we bring to the research process as well. It's also critically important to grapple with the definition of harm, and most important, in privileging how community members define harm that can then allow us to anticipate the extent to which harm may be moving throughout a process, moving throughout a design, or embedded in how we're analyzing data. And that what if we actually identify ethical principles before designing the study? So what if we imagined the development of a research study that didn't start with a research question, but started with non-negotiables or started with value sets? And I think that this was an important lesson because, again, if we actually want to work in prevention and do no harm, then centering those conversations and privileging those conversations over design, over rigor, over productivity might be essential to designing an ethical project. So taking what we've learned while constantly, individually doing the work to ensure I'm doing the right thing and my lab is doing the right thing, I began to double down on my teachings as a social worker. So I believe that social work should be at the forefront of technology design, development, and the deployment of real-world applications. And so in my work and in the lab, I posit the idea of social work thinking as an apparatus of social change within the context of social media research and algorithmic design. Social work thinking leverages the National Association of Social Work Code of Ethics, ideas like honoring the dignity and worth of every person, centering the importance of human relationships, and engaging in trustworthy practices anchor, I think, how social work can be instrumental in designing social media projects and AI-driven projects. In addition to social work thinking, I also began to interact with the work of Sasha Costanza-Choke and the Design Justice Network. All the principles outlined by the design justice community really resemble social work thinking and social work values and principles, so that was a nice alignment. I think a design justice approach layered with social work sensibilities really acts as an explicit and implicit audit of processes for social media and machine learning research. By focusing on uplifting community violence and prioritizing impact, one must consider how then hopefully to evaluate the extent to which you have accomplished your goals. And I think design justice, for me at least, has provided a framework for reimagining expertise and how knowledge is shared and disseminated. So now is the time where I'm shifting into the mayor's office project that I foreshadowed in the beginning of this talk. Here it's an important time to pause and think about the ways in which we take what we've already done as a vehicle for engaging in ethical design, ethical practices. And so this talk these studies have allowed me to think through the earlier work and the mistakes made that I think can build on and advance new partnerships that are collaborative, that are community centered, that cross different sectors, to actually build a study that integrates all of those ideas, that integrates the social worker in me, that integrates design justice, that integrates machine learning and qualitative approaches. So the aim of this project, the Neighborhood Navigator, was to develop an integrative community data science project that includes social work thinking and qualitative methods, natural language processing, computer vision, and deep community engagement. So here we understand that in order to actually do work at the city level with community members, they may also leverage some AI tool that not one thing can work by itself. That this has to be a full court approach that leverages multiple perspectives and ideas. So what we wanted to do in this work is to contextualize social media content related to public safety, quality of life, and community well-being from New York City residents that live in New York City housing. This is low-income housing in which individuals apply for that is based on income. In addition, so we wanted to leverage social media to better understand sentiment that is embedded in social media that may help us understand what community residents are going through and the ways in which the city could be could work better with community members to support some of the needs and resources that they are expressing in social media environments. We also wanted to develop a robust natural language processing and computer vision set of systems to capture sentiments regarding quality of life for New York City low-income housing residents. And then we also developed a community advisory board and conducted focus groups to evaluate ideas that emerged from computational and our earlier qualitative interviews that we also conducted with NYCHA residents as well. So here's the process that we went through. This is a joint partnership between the Mayor's Office Neighborhood Project and John Jay Criminal Justice, which was the grantee, and Columbia University was the sub-grantee. So here are a couple of processes I think are really important to point out. We wanted to harvest social media content, and so we started with Twitter, and we started with identifying mentions of NYCHA, and allow that hashtag to help us to identify users in other community spaces and other social media platforms where people are describing their experiences living in New York City housing. We wanted to engage in effective recruitment, an effective recruitment strategy with community residents. This required a deep conversations and relationships with the mayor's office to identify individuals who could be conduits for us connecting to community residents. We created a community advisory board and used those meetings and act as focus groups to evaluate some of the ideas that were coming out of the social media analysis, as well as in-depth interviews. We wanted to identify ethical principles with communities about this neighborhood navigator. So whatever this neighborhood navigator could be is an AI tool. What are the ethical principles that need to be associated with that? And then we are now in the final phases of building out a website that will report the findings to and for the impacted communities. So, as you might imagine, we're doing this work at the height of COVID, so there are a number of challenges that we had to contend with. Number one is health and COVID-19 restrictions, which limited our ability to do community engagement work. And so almost all of our events were held virtually, except for the last 6 months when things began to open up in New York City. We were able to conduct some of the interviews and focus groups in person. At the same time, we had a number of students here at Columbia, PhD students that are working on this project, and then the Columbia PhD students went on strike, and so that impacted our ability to conduct analysis. And then, of course, we were also doing this work in the middle of a mayor change, a new election that happened this year, in which we now have a new mayor, which then affected the folks who were working in the mayor's office supporting this project. And so I think that we've been able to overcome a lot of these challenges, but like with any project, there's always things that you have to account for. And so I want to take a few minutes to then kind of walk you through what this collaboration looked like and kind of each unit's role. And so we were connected to the mayor's office. We received an email from the executive director of the mayor's neighborhood action plan, who wanted to really think about how do we better tap into the sentiments of New York City residents without using traditional surveys that oftentimes miss nuance and context, but also eliminate how people are communicating in digital environments. And so the mayor's office provided us with funding for this project as a sub-grantee of John Jay, for which they already had a relationship to conduct survey analysis in this space. The mayor's office has provided ongoing support when the challenges emerge, and so they help us to think through different options to connect with participants. They provided direct connection with various employees who could help to facilitate some of our engagements. They provided us with the trust and buy-in that I think is really important to doing this work. And so the resident, we want to speak to some random researchers from Columbia, so we needed to build in and have those really strong connections with individuals in the community that could vouch for the work that we're doing. And then, as always, we have monthly meetings where we're getting feedback and recommendations on our progress as we move forward. This work is very much connected to our friends and colleagues at John Jay School of Criminal Justice. And so John Jay was the grantor who contracted to Columbia. They led our administrative activities and developed a timeline for this study and our deliverables. They continue to support our ongoing research, and so they're a part of those monthly meetings. They're giving us feedback and thoughts about analysis as well. And then they also facilitated communication between collaborators and guided our monthly meetings where updates were provided. And then for us, the Columbia unit, we develop relationships with residents in order to conduct our qualitative interviews and focus groups. We also created a team from the School of Engineering that conducted the natural language processing and computer vision analysis of the social media data we collected. We are developing a website where results are shared with the public, and it's been a really important aspect of our work to develop this website in a way that is hyper accessible for community members, or privileging community members, privileging accessibility, and leveraging an anti-racist framework to make sure that the ways in which we present the data are anti-racist. And then we are working on our final report to be shared with participants, community members, the broader public, the mayor's office, and the John Jay research team as well. I am leading the Columbia University side of this project with a team of social work researchers. We have fostered an environment where we have multiple community events to engage residents in qualitative interviews and focus groups that are analyzed currently. And this is just a quote. It's been so critical to have this level of expertise and this level of engagement with New York City residents. This is a quote from one of those residents that really speaks to why you have to be embedded in the community to do this work. And he says, once you know NYCHA, you kind of know your way around it. Like, we know it's an issue in our house. You may make a bigger thing than what it is, but someone that's new may not know how to maneuver around those kind of things, right? So here, distinguishing between kind of an outsider who might be studying NYCHA, studying New York City residents, versus really identifying links to build trusted partnerships and connections that allow you to have this deep ethnographic, qualitative, robust experience. I think it's critical for any type of algorithmic tool, technology, or emerging tool that might be used to analyze sentiment from this community. These are our colleagues from computer science. This is Dr. Kathy McEwen, who is an expert in text summarization, and Dr. Shifu Cheng, who is the interim dean of the School of Engineering. And so we have partnered with their research teams to bring in natural language processing and computer vision to our analysis. We also had the opportunity to work with Chokti Udarasari, who is a systems designer for New Animals and has ran for 20 plus years an innovation and design firm. We brought Chokti on as a collaborator to develop our community advisory boards and to evaluate and analyze the findings from those community advisory boards. So now I'm going to talk a bit more about the multimodal analysis. This is the natural language processing and computer vision side of the work. And so what we know is that users express their opinions in multiple ways in online settings. And so some users may write text or use very pithy and succinct language online to communicate and express a variety of experiences. And then others share images, right, to share about their life, to communicate with others, and to express ideas. So while many methods exist for predicting the sentiment, positive or negative, conveyed by text or images, relatively few methods have studied predicting sentiment from social media posts using a multimodal approach. And so here we leverage either modality, either natural language processing, text, or computer vision, but independently, they're insufficient to truly understand the type of data set that we're creating, which is robust with contextual experiences, lived experiences that are oftentimes hard to articulate in text versus image. We wanted to train a multimodal sentiment prediction model. Our early experiments show that our system outperforms existing methods even when only one modality is available. And so let me tell you a bit more about how this is developed. We use a snowball sampling method. We obtained around 12 million text-only tweets and around 500,000 multimodal tweets containing both images and text. We created our own automatically labeled data set to train the model, and then we looked at the cases where the sentiment prediction of the image and the text both agreed and used these examples to train our model. We then used this automatically labeled data. We trained a multimodal sentiment prediction model. We employed a number of techniques for training on this type of data called weekly supervised training to minimize the impact of incorrect training labels, which is oftentimes the case and a part of the struggle with deriving data from diverse communities. And then to understand what our model was using to make its sentiment prediction to ensure it was not relying on bias cues, we trained a model that relies on textual and image concepts to reproduce the exact same predictions as our multimodal sentiment model. So this process enables us to discover which concepts are being used by our multimodal sentiment model and make predictions for each topic. This process is important to identify and mitigate any potential biases that are learned by our sentiment model. To evaluate our systems, we then would hire community members, individuals that we identified through our qualitative and community advisory board to perform fine-grained annotations of the tweets that we found and labeled. Here are some examples from the computational analysis. Here you see an image about COVID-19 and then another image about ending gun violence. These are the types of communications and expressions that we would readily find in our data set. Now I'm going to show you some examples of when we apply the NLP tool to automatically identify positive and negative sentiment. So here's a prediction of a negative sentiment in our data set. This is an example of trash being left out on the street. Abandoned trash in New York City causes lots of environmental conditions and also impacts our rat population as well. And so this is an example of a image being predicted as being a negative sentiment. Next, we've had lots of deep conversations, actions, and engagements in New York City around Black Lives Matter. This particular post from our corpus was then predicted as being a positive post because it represents engagement around Black Lives Matter. And then here we have an example of what happens when we have challenges in our political systems. This particular image, building for lease, the lack of occupancy in our residential and our business building has been depleted. This particular image was then predicted as having a negative sentiment. So as I mentioned before, we have the social media analysis that's going on, but critical to this is like this juxtaposition of not only what we see online and understand and read online, but to interrogate what we're seeing with deep community engagement to see if we're hearing or observing new or divergent ideas from doing in-depth interviews. And so in order to stand the needs of diverse New York City communities, we've had these engagements. And so we've attended multiple community events and meetings with community organizations, and then we conducted over 69 interviews with residents that were a part of what the mayor's office called SMART sites. These are sites that the MAPS program are providing deep resources for violence prevention, health prevention, things like that. And the SMART sites represent the pilot neighborhoods where the Neighborhood Navigator, this AI tool, would then be deployed with, of course, community insight and input. And so we asked residents using a semi-structured interview guide to share their thoughts and experiences regarding quality of life, housing, built environment, community and personal safety, and their well-being, and then social media and its role in the community, COVID-19, and Black Lives Matter. So all the conditions that were permeating throughout New York City, particularly within these last 2 years. So we have some examples from our community engagement that I think are really important to highlight. We again attended community events based on what was happening in NYC complexes. We developed ongoing relationships with those community organizations and collaborated with community-based organizations to host those qualitative events, the qualitative interviewing processes. Here's a quote that we heard from one of our residents about COVID-19. They went on to say, "It's just since the pandemic, since last year and this year, I really feel scared. Like stuff is happening since the pandemic, but otherwise from then, I never really feel scared to go or to come to the neighborhood. But since last year and this year, I kind of stay inside more because of stuff happening out there," right? And so there's COVID-19 that is affecting our ability to be outside, but it also seems to be this other element around safety that is coming through indirectly and implicitly through this statement as well. We also read a lot of, have heard a lot about Black Lives Matter from our participants. And then one person says, "You would say there's a lot of crime in Black and brown communities, so when you defund the police, who's going to be there to help us? But it's also like we're not trying to say get rid of them, police, or anything. We're just saying we want them to help us." So it's like not take their money, but cut their budget because their budget is so ridiculously high for no reason, and it put into other things like public schools and transportation. We just want the better. We just want a better community. So in this quote, the participant highlights the nuance within the defund the police movement. They understand the need for police when crime occurs, but feel like effective policing can be done in tandem with redistributing police funds towards efforts to address the root causes. So this is like critical insight that really should be moved through the mayor's office and act as evidence for how to think about strategies and connections with communities and where resources can be divvied up or redistributed. And then lastly, we also have a post about social media. This is this is an individual talking about social media as an environment. Of course, you got to make people feel like they've accomplished something, you know? So it's like being able to like comments, like "great job" or something like that is a positive thing. And I understand the power that has in any kind of way, especially a positive comment, is kind of something you're highlighting. So here we have the note that someone is engaging in likes and making positive remarks in order to create an environment on social media that is positive. So here you understand that community members have identified strategies for enacting positive and affirming and thriving environments on social media. How might the mayor's office and other entities in New York City leverage this engagement that users have already identified in order to help better and sustain the communities. And so we also, as I mentioned before, conducted 2 advisory board uh, focus groups. We call them CABs. The CABs allowed residents from different New York City communities, from all those 10 sites, to hear about the project objectives of the Neighborhood Navigator and to report experiences with community-based technology and AI. So we not only wanted to hear about how they felt about the Neighborhood Navigator, but also about their own personal experiences with AI and technology throughout their buildings and in their kind of day-to-day life in New York City. At the conclusion of each qualitative interviews, a social work researcher invited participants to participate in these virtual CABs, and we were able to identify 38 residents who participated in these virtual CABs. We conducted 4 focus groups across 2 days. First 2 focus groups were conducted by a social work student and a user researcher to understand how residents measured community safety in the use of technology. And there are a couple of things that really came out of that. Number one is that we learned that NYCHA residents really desire the ability to spend time outside. This is an important element of kind of how they wanted to experience their neighborhood and wanted to communicate these ideas to the mayor's office. And number 2, really focusing on the upkeep and maintenance of the built environment. This is the built environment, the buildings that they live in, and the neighborhoods in which they are embedded in as well. And the second round of focus groups was designed for participants to see the initial interface of the Neighborhood Navigator and to make recommendations on name and user functionality in order to maximize community engagement. We also heard a lot more about the sentiments, the community's sentiments towards local government. And one of the things that I think residents felt was that local government did not fully understand the needs of NYCHA communities, or did understand but failed to do anything meaningful to create change. And so this reflected in their comments concerning inequities and prioritizing budgets and spending on their very specific neighborhoods as well. And so again, this really important feedback that then challenges and helps us to think about what is the hope of this Neighborhood Navigator? Is it going to be useful? Is it going to be effective as well? We're still in the process of analyzing our CAP interviews, but we'll have more to speak on that in future events. And then lastly, we are, the couple of final steps that are happening now. We're developing a final report which will present the ideas and recommendations that integrate findings from all 3 components to the mayor's office. And what I'm really most excited about now is that we've been working with a Black-owned design company to develop a website. This website incorporates a holistic view of our research findings across qualitative CAB meetings and the multimodal work. We've been working really hard to make sure that this work is publicly accessible in every way, and then linking what has already been done around data visualization of the various findings that have emerged from the work as well. But the website is really intent on reflecting a deep understanding of community wants and needs and goals and desired outcomes through an anti-racist lens. And then for our final step, as a lab, we will hold online discussions with community members and organizations to review our findings and conclusions from the final report, and will respond to email requests regarding content from that website as well. And so in conclusion, there are just a number of things that I want to highlight. I think applying interdisciplinary methodologies and practices to social media and machine learning research can provide policymakers with insights into public sentiment to strengthen government work in a way that benefits communities and also helps us to focus and think through what is it like to have true partnerships between local city governments using social media and to improve the experiences of community members. I think it's also important to reimagine tech-driven relationships with government, community organizations, and residents to better understand community needs. And then really leveraging reflexivity as a tool regarding how we engage in ethical processes and to determine goals that, again, prioritize and center the experiences of minority community members here in New York City. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Desmond. That was terrific. Folks listening, if you've got questions, now is your time to pop them in the chat. In the meantime, I have lots of questions. I guess I'd like to start with, I'm a fan of your work, but let me start with this question, which may be a little ironic coming from me of all people, but why start with Twitter?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that we searched really hard to identify social media locations where we might be able to identify communication between New York City NYCHA residents and the mayor's office. And so we started off by trying to examine spaces where the hashtag NYCHA would come up. And the most prolific space in which that hashtag came up was on Twitter. And we found an abundance of posts and communications that were sent by NYCHA residents to the mayor's office about NYCHA conditions, about general well-being, about violence. And there's just an abundance of posts there. And so that became our initial starting place. We also we have reached out to other platforms in which we are seeing some communication around NYCHA in New York City. That was not as fruitful as we had hoped, but it certainly was a part of our thinking in terms of collecting this corpus.
Thanks. We have a question from Madeline Depp from I hope I got your last name right, Madeline, from the Urban Innovation Team at Microsoft Research. And Madeline asks, first of all, she says, thank you so much for sharing this important work. The question she has is about different models for communicating, for collaborating with communities. There's been a lot of interest in community advisory boards. I think we heard about that last time from Tawana Dillahunt as well. Which is exciting, but it's also one that she thinks of as fairly low on, I don't know this, the Arnstein ladder of citizen participation. I'm going to have to read up on that. She asked, can you talk a little bit about what you find most effective in sharing power with community members, especially when conducting and reporting on technical analyses?
Oh, this is such a good question. And thank you for the question. Honestly, I really think that it starts with you. And one of the things that I am doing a lot of thinking and writing about is reflexivity. And so before we can even engage in a conversation around how we can partner with communities and other people, I think we should first start with what are our values, what are our principles as it relates to those types of engagements, and what power are we, the researcher, the tech company, willing to give up in order to have a true partnership. There's also a part of this reflexive activity is to also, and I always have Mary Gray in the back of my mind, like, what are your non-negotiables in terms of doing this work? And so when we were approached by the mayor's office to do this work, they weren't necessarily interested in all of the community engagement elements, right? They were primarily interested in how do we collect neighborhood sentiment from New York City residents that are living in our low-income housing, and how do we do this in a way to reduce our reliance on surveys? And so a part of our conversation and negotiation around this grant and this opportunity was the fact that we need to be able to work and partner with residents. Their voices, their ideas need to be front and center. They need to be a part of every element of the interpretation of analysis as well. This was, of course, complicated in the COVID era, right? Because the majority of our focus groups and interviews were conducted via Zoom. And so there's always lots of complexities around, like, how you share time and tripping over words and those kind of things. But I think what I experienced is an appreciation of honoring the voice, of paying people very well for their participation. So we actually had to kind of go to bat with our research offices to pay people above what participants are normally paid, because we view this as community expertise, as domain expertise, and should be compensated the same ways in which I would be compensated to provide domain expertise. And so that's a roundabout way of saying that I actually think that it starts with you and really kind of laying out the purpose, your question, and what are you willing to give up in the process. Nancy, I can't hear you. I think you're muted.
You're right. Thanks for pointing that out. It's not a video conference without somebody doing that. All right. We got a few more questions coming in. Emily Lee asked a question that I have as well, and I know that your work has sometimes been criticized with concerns about surveillance and whether it's, well, as Emily puts it, are there concerns about governments utilizing this tool to police and manipulate the communities you're trying to serve? And I guess in general, a question that arises out of the work is there any responsible design that's functions as surveillance when used against those whom you're trying to help rather and prevent harm from happening? And how do you think about that challenge? I know some people would say you should not be collaborating with the police at all. You shouldn't be collaborating with the government at all.
Yeah, this is such an important question, and one that I think is also very complicated. I think this is why the interviews and community advisory board conversations were imperative, because we asked them the same thing. The city wants to create the sentiment tool. What do you think about it? And here's the thing that I think we need to situate, or we need to sit in for a little bit, is that ideas around surveillance can oftentimes, from my perspective, be things that are liberal conversations. I think the conversation around surveillance looks and feels differently when you're a resident that lives in a neighborhood where crime and gun violence is at an all-time high. And so ideas around surveillance are complicated, right? It harkens back to the '94 crime bill, where lots of Black residents wanted very strict crime policies because they were worried about safety. And so the same thing kind of comes out in this type of space as well, where we're having conversations. A lot of residents wanted connection to the mayor's office in a way that would make them responsive to the needs that they develop themselves. And so if they say they want more cameras because that keeps them safe, then from my perspective as a social worker, I think it's something that we should be listening to. And so it complicates this idea around what is surveillance and who gets to determine what surveillance is, how much surveillance is too much surveillance, right? And so I think that what we've been trying to do is to say, let's honor and listen to the residents of the neighborhood to speak about the needs that they have and what they would like to see from the city. Now, I've always had concerns around the utility of these types of tools, especially when there are changes in administration. And so as a part of our partnership, most of the folks that we were working with have left the organization. So they had great intentions, great ideas, and now we're working with completely different new folks. And so I think a part of it is, with the website that we're creating, is to create a space where residents can capture data, access information in a way that's highly accessible, to be able to engage in conversations and pushbacks in ways that allow them to do this work.
Can I follow on with the question that I had, which also speaks to this, which is, do the residents speak with one voice when you're thinking about community and engaging the community? I mean, boy, there's a lot of Black and Latinx people in New York City, right? It seems to say, well, the community, how do you deal with conflict within the community? And I would imagine this would be one of many topics on which the community would not speak with a single voice.
No, you're absolutely right. There certainly isn't a myopic voice in this space, but there are some major things that I think we see as a through line between the sites that we work with. And number one is that folks want clean, healthy, thriving neighborhoods and local environments to live and to dream in and to raise their children in. So regardless of your ethnicity or which block you're on or which site you're embedded in, that particular theme, we saw lots of uniformity around. I think the types of engagement with the mayor's office is where we see lots of differences, right? So there are tried and true community members that really believe in building strong networks with the mayor's office and having strong advocacy and really engaging in this back and forth with the mayor's office to achieve goals where there are other residents who are like, burn it all down, this is horrible, they're never going to be able to help us. And so I think at the end of the day, raising all the concerns and trying to map out the things that we can do, the things that are challenging, and to be transparent about those ideas, I think for me is the way to go.
Yeah, that's helpful. There's also a question about IRBs, the process for interacting with IRBs, specifically concerns about using social media as a field site for sampling and data collection, and interactions that you've had, if any, with tech company policies, and probably in this case, primarily Twitter, around data privacy and access.
Yeah, great question. So IRB has been a journey and an adventure over the last 10 years, from barely any policy that would hinder us from doing the work to now folks having a bit more understanding of the challenges, biases, potential harms to community members. With every study, we have to get IRB approval, but we also identify additional ethical steps that we want to take as a lab and as a research group to protect folks in our sample. The work, with Twitter, we only access publicly available data, no private data. Identify users through snowballing mechanisms and also geotagging folks to be within the radius that we're focused on within New York City. But beyond that, there wasn't much else.
One of the things I admire about your work is your ability to bridge, right? So you bridge disciplines, but you also bridge kinds of institutions. So you bridge between academia and civic organizations, between academia and community organizations, between academia and government, and then between disciplines within academia. That's a heck of a hat trick. I'm wondering, what advice do you have? And I guess I want to frame it as more than one question, because I don't want to assume that it's the same for collaborating between social work and computer science as it is for collaborating between social work and a mayor's office. But what kinds of advice do you have for people who would like to do work that does bridge across these kinds of boundaries, both in terms of working across disciplines and working across organizational types?
Yeah, that's such an important question. And honestly, this work has been really hard. So I want to be really clear that it's not been easy. It's really hard. It's very complicated. Sometimes I want to pull my beard hair out because I don't have any hair anymore. So I want to be clear that this is not an easy process. But, a part of it in terms of success has really been, again, to stick to values and principles that have evolved over time. And so one of the things that I wanted to make clear early on in the talk was that I didn't start here. This is not where I began. This has been, years of critique, my own critique, putting myself out there, learning, making mistakes. And I think that doing that work, putting myself in conversations with an amazing cadre of Black scholars that are doing this work, and tech, many of who you've already had come to this space, has allowed me to develop a set of values and principles that allow me to enter conversations with the mayor's office and with community members that center lived experience. There were lots of complications with how we do things and the types of questions that we ask and why are we doing it this way. And I think that a part of it I had to have this muscle and this level of confidence around, because these are the values that we hold in this space, that we cannot do this work in a way that just focuses on
social media as the sole tool for understanding human behavior. And I think a lot of companies, a lot of folks would just simply like to rely on social media. And a part of our ask was that social media is faulty. Human interpretation is faulty. We need we need to triangulate how we collect data, how we interpret data, and how this data is disseminated. And so being able to be very clear in those ideas and in our mission and our aims for the work, I think was really helpful. But there was lots of pushback along the way.
And what about in working with computer scientists and just thinking about, I just came from a discussion before this talk where we were talking about just the challenges of disciplines having their own jargon and ideas about what constitutes an interesting research question. How have you navigated that?
Yeah, I've been really lucky to work with a phenomenal group of computer scientists at Columbia in which we've learned each other, right? And so we've made those early mistakes where we have open and difficult dialogue around language, how we think about data, how we talk about data, how we access data. And now we're at the point where it's very clear to me that my computer science colleagues value the expertise that social work brings, that community members bring. And I think that was a process that evolved over time. But for me, it has been a really wonderful experience. And what I appreciate about computer scientists is that they're not afraid of a hard question, right? And so we bump up against a problem, no one's running away or retreating, we move full force and really try to think through multiple options.
Quite the opposite, the reverence for the hard question. The hard question is the good question. All right. And you are definitely asking hard questions, and we are at time. And so thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who attended. And we had a question for the report. You mentioned a report earlier, and we were hoping to be able to provide a link to that report. So
the report is not finished, but we will have that early summer. So I would love to look back with you all and give you access to the website, and the website will have links to the report as well.
All right. Thanks so much. All right. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you, Desmond. See you next time with Christina Harrington. Bye.